10x your service design offering with Smapply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smapply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smapply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
This podcast is recorded in Australia, on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and give thanks to the knowledge they have shared. Hello and welcome to Moments of Change. My name is Melanie Rayment and I'm a social designer based in Sydney, Australia, and currently a director at the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. Moments of Change is a podcast dedicated to exploring the moments that we learn from as we seek to design and cultivate positive social change. In this episode, I speak with Kelly Ann McKercher. Kelly Ann is a designer, artist and author of Beyond Sticky Notes, Doing Co-Design for Real. They lead design in Australia's largest public pathology and forensic service, whilst also teaching social design and supporting individuals and organisations to develop ethical and inclusive design practice. Kelly Ann has worked for a number of leading design agencies across Australia and New Zealand, including the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, Optimal Experience and the Innovation Unit, and has a background in design, social innovation and social anthropology. Kelly Ann is a truly mindful practitioner, and we explore their views on what authentic co-design looks like by diving straight into the contents of their new book, unpacking the nuanced understanding of what inclusion looks like, the power of trusting relationships, and the mindsets and behaviours needed to do true social design. I hope you enjoy this episode of Moments of Change. Kelly Ann, welcome to Moments of Change.
Thanks, Mel. It's lovely to be with you.
Thank you. Let's kick off. How do you describe your current role and how do you think your view of your purpose has evolved over your career?
I guess my current role is a little bit of a mixture of things. It's primarily about increasing, I guess, the literacy or the fluency of organisations in their practice of design, be that the kind of design that's about designing for people, designing with people, or even better, being able to be led entirely by people and sort of standing back and letting people to, I guess, take the reins, but also determine their own agenda rather than having an agenda determined for them.
Beautiful.
So that looks like a little bit of work currently in public health. It looks like a little bit of work, I guess, coaching individuals who want to build their own design practice. Maybe they've already got one. Maybe they've moved across from a different flavour of design, be that industrial design or product design or tech. And then it looks a little bit like working with executives or kind of senior bureaucrats who really want to be able to commission design, but are a bit bamboozled. I guess the wild west of design methods that are sort of out there and not really knowing where to start to achieve their goals. I guess in terms of how my purpose has changed over time, I don't know if that's been an intentional thing, but rather probably a series of experiences and particular projects where I've been maybe disturbed a little bit out of my kind of privilege and security and sense of what sort of my role is inside the system and my role as a designer. And that's probably led me to thinking much more about where is my place to stand and what are the types of projects and initiatives that I should be involved in and which are the ones that I should be standing back, getting out of the way, or I guess supporting from the wings.
Yeah, I love that idea of being value-led in terms of what are the projects that I shouldn't be involved in. I think that's a continuing tension for a lot of designers, particularly in an environment where, you still have to put food on the table. So it's so interesting to sort of hear that up front and centre with yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So congratulations on your new book, Beyond Sticky Notes, Doing Co-Design for Real. That's very exciting. I'm having a lot of FOMO because my Twitter feed is lighting up with everyone holding it in their hands.
Thank you.
Well done. I've enjoyed watching the little snippets come through as you've created that, and it's really exciting. Tell me, what does co-design mean to you in this instance, and how does the book sort of unpack some of the
Mm.
nuances that perhaps people often miss
Mm.
to sort of go beyond that word to a really truly transformative approach for creating positive change in people's lives?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thank you for your congratulations. So, look, I guess the book is 3 parts. The first part of the book deals with the social movement part of co-design and a recognition that I guess many people don't get the opportunity to participate in the decisions that shape their lives, their bodies, their livelihoods.
Mm,
And that as a result of that, we see these enormous policy gaps between what decision makers think people want and need and what people and families themselves would define as their aspirations, their goals, and their hopes for the types of services, policy, whatever that they receive. Not that anyone particularly dreams of services or having more services. So the
I hope
first part
not.
of the book, oh, no, is really dealing with the social movement of, I guess, transforming inequitable power structures,
Mm,
changing our mindset around who are the right people to be making decisions. It sort of poses, I guess, a bit of a framework for a set of social movements for us to be sort of adopting if we're going to work in more participatory and more power sharing ways, which I guess is about doing, of course, with people, not for them. It's
mm,
about shifting out of a very colonizing, ableist, heteronormative sort of perspective into one that recognizes and responds to dimensions of difference. It sort of goes into, I guess, a bit of unpacking of power and privilege and how we sort of need to be quite sensitive of who we are in relationship to the people that we're trying to work with, if we should be working with those
mm,
people in the first place. And I guess poses an idea to designers that we might exercise power and partnership and that we sort of might move into a more of a coaching and supporting role as opposed to kind of asserting that, like kind of design hero or design dominance where we assume we know what people want and need. And when we do that, I guess it
mm.
removes the need for their input entirely sometimes.
It's so embedded in design education, though, is that sort of design as a hero, and I hope that design education is slowly unraveling that. But what I hear in what you're saying there, Kellyanne, is that how do you sort of go beyond that typical trope of design with, which is held up often as the sort of hero to co-design, to actually like getting underneath the skin of these issues or these conditions that are holding things in
Mm,
place like structural racism or unraveling sort of decolonization of design and moving to more holding a space that's not heteronormative. Like, how do you sort of move into the depth of that through co-design to really look
mm.
at sort of mutual learning and relation the power of relationships?
Look, I think we sort of need to act at multiple levels. I think the first level to act on is one that's about small circles. And
Mm,
that's really about how we convene people with lived experience, professionals, people inside of organizations making decisions and sort of convene them around something that they all care about. And in that sort of process of designing, build what I think are sort of the necessary mindsets for these types of ways of being and doing, which are things like curiosity, hospitality, learning by doing, elevating lived experience, valuing many perspectives. Because I almost think like before you doing co-design, you almost have to be being co-design and having
mm,
those sort of supportive, I guess, mindsets and attitudes that aren't just about designing with people, but also seeing relationships as being able to be more dignified and seeing people being able to speak about their own experiences but not have to talk on behalf of anyone else. And I
mm,
think that when we convene really small circles and build capability and mindsets, those are things that create much bigger circles and sort of ripples out into systems. And I think particularly
mm,
if we engage, decision makers or influencers who are already part of the dominant power structure and we're able to shift their mindset and attitude in some way that often I think opens up the opportunity for those types of ways of being and doing to be applied across other settings and in other spaces where we've possibly had quite a paternalistic way of seeing people as sort of passive recipients as opposed to co producers. But I guess it's not enough to just work at that small circle, and we can do so much incredible design work in small rooms and in small conversations, but that doesn't necessarily shift systems.
Mm.
So I think we also sort of have to be looking up and out and around and intervening in the structures of institutions themselves, which might be about how is a project set up and who's in a room in the first place to talk about its scope? What kinds of governance models are we using and who's ultimately making decisions? What kinds of incentives do we have for sort of more participatory and more power sharing ways of being and doing, or kind of disincentives do we have? How
Mm.
do we sort of evaluate and learn at scale? I think it's almost like an onion. There's sort of a number of different layers to peel off and conditions to build, which I often think is sometimes about very ordinary things like, do you have money to pay people with lived experience? Or do you have the right kinds of skilled people to convene this work? And are you paying and supporting them, or are you expecting them to do it on top of their existing, already busy day job?
It's good to hear you sort of speak about what those small circles might mean at scale and how you would sort of enable voice across those sort of layers of the system.
Mm.
Because I think there is a misconception in some of the work that I've been involved in across the years that this sort of co-design thing is, oh, it's over there, it's over where the people are. And
Mm.
then in the institution, it's almost like they're just seeking the answers to be fed back. And so, actually, what you really need them to do is create that connection and embed themselves in the being of co-design as well, because
Mm.
that's where that really great value comes to be able to shift power structures or shift organizational sort of framing of particular
Mm.
issues.
Absolutely.
So tell us about what's the moment of change that you've brought today to share with us.
Yeah, so look, when I was thinking about co-design and thinking about some of the moments where perhaps I realized a little bit about myself and my practice and what was effective and what wasn't, was working on a particular project a couple of years ago where we were trying to co-design better mental health, drug and alcohol, and suicide prevention services and supports. And really, a very refreshing project where we walked in and found an executive who already had this desire to change their business structures to support a different way of designing, not
Mm,
just to have a series of workshops and then go back into their room and decide what they would and would not listen to.
mm,
And I suppose the other thing that shouldn't be courageous but was courageous was also naming a number of different groups of people for whom we know have disproportionately poor mental health outcomes and who are not well served by our sort of mainstream or universal systems and supports, and to call those folks out very explicitly and say that we
mm.
want to have a co-design process that, I guess, responds to those dimensions of difference, as I mentioned earlier, but also builds different kinds of relationships between clinicians and between people with lived experience.
So, how did that sort of process unfold for you across your journey? I guess with the people with lived experience in that space, but also interestingly with the sort of commissioning organisation as well.
Yeah, so look, I guess the first thing, which is often a real standout, is what is the current level of sort of literacy that the organisation has about designing with, or even going a step further to be led by. And that often
Mm,
involves lots of conversations, of course, with executives, but also with our, like very traditional community advisory groups or clinical advisory groups to get a sense for, I guess, what are they thinking and hoping? How has their participation been a part of projects in the past, and where has that fallen a little bit short?
mm,
So I guess everything starts with immersing and aligning, of course, of getting a sense of, what has been done. Where has that already been strong? Where are there relationships? Where is there a lack of relationships? And where are the, I guess, already people in community who are knitting together services and supports for each other because services themselves have failed or not being able to quite reach them, which I think is a different frame to the one we usually use in design, where we expect going in to find something new or to find that something isn't working or hasn't worked, and not necessarily expecting to find kind of a web of resource that perhaps we could be better seeing and supporting that kind of already exists at that community level. I
Mm.
guess the other part was also I had this idea of having like a co-design ombuds person because I knew that as a convener of co-design that I wanted to be really accountable and make sure that I was the right person for this process and that the different groups that we were bringing together felt dignified, I guess, in that process. So I had a member of the client organisation become the ombuds person, and they became the one who did all of the kind of pre-relationship work with every single co-designer so that by the time we brought them together for the first gathering, there was already a sense of relationship there and already a sense of some of the kind of curation aspects that we might want to bring into the room in terms of who might we sit together, what type of triggering language might we need to avoid for particular people in recovery, which types of clinicians were going to be a really slow burn and who possibly had some mindsets and attitudes that we might have needed to work on a little bit before exposing them to, for example, people with really diverse gender identities.
Mm.
So I think we underestimate all the work that we have to do before we get in the room together and sort of assume that everyone will feel safe and comfortable and included and welcome. And I guess even after doing a bunch of that work to build relationships prior to getting in the room, to start to understand something about people's aspirations, their hopes, their previous experiences, there were still a few people that never made it into the room. And I guess that always bothers me. And, probably part of the reason of writing the book was trying to unpack for myself how do we really think about, I guess, safety and welcome ahead of design activities, be they a workshop or an interview or whatever type of session, so that we aren't losing so many people before their contributions are even able to be heard.
Yeah, that rings true for me in previous experience, in the UK is actually some people are not ready to share their voice in those types of sort of service organizations where people sort of hold up the value of the voice of lived experience, the voice of young
Mm.
people, but actually some people aren't there yet, and that's okay.
Mm.
And so, what responsibility do we have in certain situations where it might be a particular institution that is holding some of that role in advocating for those people? Is what role do they play in actually sort of paving the way for people to just feel ready to share their voice if
Mm.
that's what they would like to do in the future, and it might not be actually now. And so, moving beyond this, or prior to this idea of the workshop, is actually there's just a lot of relational work to go on behind the scenes to make people feel comfortable.
Yeah, there is. And I suppose the other aspect is that, I've been really curious over the last couple of years of working a lot in sort of mental health and drug and alcohol and having a lot of those things intersect with my own lived experience of what role design, relationship, really good relational design can have in being part of recovery itself. And we know
Mm,
that sort of in recovery, community, the support of peers, someone saying me too are all really important aspects, as is having choices. And I think sometimes we have this temptation because we want to look after people and we're worried about risk and we, think about things like vulnerability, that we think so much about that we just automatically exclude their participation and make decisions on behalf of them. And I've seen some
mm,
some really good tools lately that a few organizations have put together that, are really a self-assessment for a person to be able to sit down and think through some different ways of, am I ready to be involved in suicide prevention activity? Am I ready to be involved in recovery
mm,
activity? And if I'm ready, what might be the different ways that I might be involved? I think that really a great many people do want to share their voices, but the forums that we make available to them are just not that meaningful. um, and what they're met with is, a crappy workshop where people sit around a boardroom table and ask often quite invasive and quite, neglecting of strength. And then we're sort of surprised when they say, I'm not coming back for the next session. So I think we're so rushed, like quick to rush to the work and not sort of able to spend enough time, and this is a little bit different in Australia than it is in New Zealand, to say maybe building relationships both with co-designers but also between co-designers and have the kind of fabric of social connection all the way through the design process Like, maybe that's really the thing we should be investing as much as possible, not sort of just getting straight into the design activities.
I was thinking, coming into this interview today, I was thinking about sort of getting into the depths of authentic co-design and what good looks like. And I was explaining it to a colleague, and I said, I remember this situation in the UK where myself and a particular colleague on a program, we were talking about including, young people participation in a workshop. And we're both nodding around the table as we seemingly are in agreement about, this is an important thing for a young person to be involved in, and ideally, they are expressing what would good look like in terms of support for them, and of course, indeed, not taking the tact of tell us all the bad stuff that's happened and how we'd fix it, but actually sort of putting them in a position that they are the expert. But I was just thinking about, actually, when I saw that in action, that person, in my opinion, had put a young person in a situation that I think was not the best situation for them. That
Mm.
really all these notions of what good co-design looked like and the power of lived experience and designing with suddenly just fell beneath my feet as I realized the nuance of intent and behaviors and understanding behind that was not aligned.
Mm.
How do you sort of bridge that gap with people in terms of the really sort of considered approaches?
Look, I think there's kind of a couple of things. One being a show, don't tell. I think it's almost impossible to explain to someone that's never seen a really relational and careful and generous design process in action how that might be different. And I've often noticed that when I've involved people in that process, it's only after,
Mm.
a meaningful session, series of sessions, a win of some kind that we've then be able to, I guess, sit down together and for them to kind of be coached through their own realizations about how that is different and how
Mm.
that feels different and how that was convened different. And I guess there's an accountability to how professionals behave too that I think we don't always hold each other to account on, and sort of
Mm.
some of the things that professionals say and do in relationship with people with lived experience is so demeaning and sort of can just undermine any sort of session. And I almost think that we're too quick, as I mentioned, to rush into the room, that we don't necessarily say ahead of that time, hey, we're going to do a little bit of work together to prepare you for your participation. I think what we focus on is that there's all these people with lived experience and they're the ones that need to change. I actually think it's the opposite thing, that it's, the system needs to be much better at listening and professionals need to be much more generous and self aware. And there's some professions that haven't had a lot of that asked of them. So it can be a bit affronting, to sit someone down before a session and say, like, these are some behaviors that are not okay. And these are some ways that we will all be to create a mutual environment of safety. And I think, sometimes also we bring professionals into environments that don't themselves have enough connection with the what we're exploring. So I guess one of the things that I always try to do is make sure that at least some of the professionals in co-design share an identity in some way with people with lived experience so that it's not performative.
Yeah.
Because I think in so many places, as you say, we get caught up in the performance of caring about lived experience, but have not carved out the necessary structures or even just basic stuff like body language of, when someone shares an experience and being stuck in fact checking and continuously saying, that didn't happen. That's not how it should have happened. And I can remember in this project that we're speaking about, the moment that sticks most powerfully in my head was turning around and seeing he would have been like probably 65-year-old clinician, very conservative man, speaking to a young gender diverse person with lived experience. And they were having this really like in-depth conversation about each other. And that was sort of the moment that I sort of realized, like, this process of relationship first and kind of curiosity and slowly and gently working together over, I think it was probably about 8 or 9 sessions. Like, this relationship is the result of that investment.
Mm.
And without that sort of investment in kind of bringing this group together, that particular conversation probably never would have happened. And that
Mm.
clinician never would have taken then that shift in his practice back into his day-to-day working environment where, it's possible that now he's able to have different kinds of conversations and create a sense of welcome for people that not because he was poorly intentioned, but because he didn't know how to have conversations across difference.
I'm thinking as you say this, the I'm sure there are people listening going, but how do you measure that? What's the yardstick of success that you go to the lead client and say this was successful? How do you approach? I guess I'm doing air quotes. You can't see me, but air quotes around sort of measurement in this space where actually we're really holding the intent of authentic relationships at the heart of how we're going about practice.
Yeah, look, I think there's a couple of things there. There's how we monitor and evaluate the process itself of co-design or co-production. And then there's how we monitor and evaluate the benefit of having worked in that way to create a new thing, whether that thing be policy or service or whatever. I think when it comes to the process side of things, I mean, some of the questions that I often ask co-designers is how do we feel about each other? And do we feel like we're investing in something hopeful together? I'm sure that our monitoring and evaluation friends would be like, that's not a monitoring and evaluation question. But to me, those
Almost certain.
I'm almost certain. Those to me are kind of two of the questions that I'm kind of wanting to know as a convener. When it comes to the actual what we're making together though, the part that I care most about monitoring, evaluating and learning about is the shift in underpinning mindsets and attitudes. So I think a lot of our services, our programs, we get very caught up in how we're going to do them. Like, what are the channels? What's the brochure like? What's the website? God forbid, what's the app? And in that, we kind of lose the fact that in some of these systems, like mental health, for example, what we need is a shift from big psychiatry to kind of big community, as the Aotearoa Wellbeing Manifesto describes, which, some of those underpinning values and attitudes that people are practicing from or working from, I think often they're the most interesting things to try to get a baseline of and then to keep a track of over time. Because I would sort of argue that those underlying mindsets and attitudes are what really shifts our practice, particularly as professionals. And that if we can sort of understand what matters most and how people want to be treated and then notice the gaps in that, I think we haven't quite caught up with the citizen accountability part too. So we're often doing these kind of processes where we hear what people want and need, but then we don't build indicators in that they've defined for themselves. We're still using the same kind of indicators and outcome measures that the system wants. Like, for example, did people leave hospital before they got their treatment, which is not necessarily an outcome that a patient would define for themselves. So I think there's lots of work to do in that space, and monitoring and evaluation is certainly not my background, but I have seen sort of some really interesting measurements when we focus particularly on the mindsets and attitudes, and when we understand really, really, really deeply which are the ones that people with lived experience want, need, and expect, and how do we know if that's not happening inside of a system.
I've got a curly question for you. The term lived experience, how does that sit with you in referring to people that have experience with a particular issue?
I heard someone the other day say there's no such thing as a lived experience, there's living experience, which I was kind of thinking about the past tense part of that, in some ways lived experience suggests that something's over. But I think when it comes to a lot of recovery from trauma, addiction, violence, whatever it is, it's probably living experience more so than lived experience, but I don't think that has the same ring to it. When it comes to that term, I have heard some people be very critical because they feel like it's a term that's owned by mental health specifically
Right.
and has sort of been birthed by or born by that particular social movement around increasing the dignity of people in mental health who, for example, might have been involuntary hospitalized or restrained. I think if I take that from like a personal level, I found it very kind of liberating to be able to connect my own lived experience up to the types of issues, challenges, opportunities that I work on. And I have always found that to be a beneficial thing when I'm able to work with a group of people where we share some kind of experience, and we know a little bit about how it feels to have had an experience and to be living the effects of an experience.
Mm.
I think that unfortunately, lived experience can be a bit misappropriated into people can then become proxies or sort of representatives, and lived experience workers then kind of sometimes end up as the system thinks that they're done. And because they've got a lived experience worker, they never have to talk to anyone with lived experience ever
Mm.
again. And I think the other place where we conflate this is in carers and families. And, carers and families have their own series of experiences that, can also be really traumatic and hard, but that they don't get to speak on behalf of the people that they're caring for. So I think the lived experience space, the lived experience leadership space, I think there's some teething issues with that, particularly here in Australia, as we see like a really big increase of the language of lived experience roles, but we don't necessarily see a matched increase in the capacity of systems to know how to listen, how to support someone in a lived experience role, but to also sort of call out where people might use their lived experience to, I guess, demean or silence others.
I'd love to see it move beyond its use in terms of othering people to really centering around like an asset that person brings to potentially that role. And I think there is those, I'm sort of seeing in Australia those opportunities where people are held up with those assets into particular roles, and that's their pathway into those new jobs, new roles in particularly, I guess, government and sort of third sector organisations in Australia.
Yeah, I think I agree with that in terms of seeing the resilience and strength of it, not just the disadvantage or the hardship of it. I think the thing, however, that we miss sometimes though is that everyone in co-design has something to teach and something to learn. And I
Yeah.
think sometimes when we become stuck in this advocacy kind of role, what happens is we're talking at each other. And I understand why some advocates have fallen into that, because it's the system is hard and gnarly and aggressive, and they're matching that with that. But I wonder sometimes where lived experience doesn't have the resonance or impact we hope for because it's not malleable enough and it's not soft enough at the edges to be able to
Mm.
sort of let other people in to be collaborators and co-creators, because I think often professionals come to co-design and they sort of say things like, "Oh, I just won't talk. I'll just let the people with lived experience talk because I don't want to freak them out." And of
Mm.
course, that's not co-design because that's not mutual learning.
Mm.
It sort of has to go all kinds of different ways, the learning. So I think some of those traditional advocacy models, I wouldn't necessarily call them co-design, but I think they can find a home in co-design if people are able to sort of soften their armor. And I know that sort of particularly survivors and people who've experienced a lot of trauma, that could be a really hard thing to do, and hence the need to really delicately build relationship and build conditions for participation.
Kelly Ann, I think I could talk to you all afternoon, and thankfully we live in the same city now, so it's possible to keep doing that. But we're actually coming to the end of Moments of Change, and I wanted to ask you before we leave, what's that big, wildly important goal that you're thinking across the next year in terms of your practice that you might share with others?
Look, I sort of holding on to a really difficult and sad experience of having been a foster parent recently. And
Mm.
there's been a lot of things in that experience that I've noticed about participation, about the system, about lived experience, about power. And I need to, for myself, direct those somewhere. So I'm hoping that in the next kind of 6 to 12 months, I can find a place where, having written this book, coaching in this practice, that I sort of find a way to match up the things that I guess write about and teach with some of the reform and the change that I would like to be a part of setting in motion in some of the systems that we feel reasonably harmed by ourselves.
Thanks for sharing that, Kelly Ann. Thank you so much for coming on Moments of Change. Tell me, how can people get a hold of your shiny new book?
Yes. So if you'd like to read the Kindle version, it's on Amazon. You can just search Beyond Sticky Notes. If you'd like to buy a paperback, you can go to my website, which is www.beyondstickynotes.com, and you can order that from just about anywhere in the world. But if I don't have your place, then just reach out to me. You can find me on Twitter at Co-Design Club, and happy to try to work something out if you are in some place that mail is hard to get to. Thank you so much for having me today, Mel.
Thanks, Kelly Ann. That's all for this episode of Moments of Change. If you liked this episode, feel free to visit thisishcd.com, where you can access our back catalogue of over 100 episodes, with episodes relating to service design, product management, design research, and much, much more. You can join the This Is HCD newsletter, where you'll receive updates from the network, or join the Slack community on thisishcd.com. I look forward to sharing more stories with you. Until next time.